So here's a story that sounds like it belongs in a movie, but every bit of it actually happened. We're talking about a guy who spent years on the FBI's most wanted list, a man whose name alone used to make agents nervous, someone who built an empire out of fear, violence, and pure criminal genius. And for the longest time, nobody could touch him. This is the story of how that man finally got caught. Let's start at the beginning, because to understand how huge this capture was, you first need to understand how untouchable this guy seemed to be. He didn't start out as some criminal mastermind. Like a lot of these stories, it began small. Petty crimes, small-time hustles, the kind of stuff that barely gets a mention in a local newspaper. But this guy had something different. He had ambition, he had patience, and most dangerously, he had the kind of mind that could plan 5 steps ahead while everyone else was still on step 1. As the years went by, his operations grew. What started as small-scale stuff turned into something much bigger, much darker, and much more organized. We're talking drug trafficking networks that span multiple states, sometimes even crossing borders. We're talking extortion rings that kept entire neighborhoods living in fear. We're talking murders, ordered coldly, executed precisely, and covered up so well that investigators would spend years just trying to prove they even happened. And here's the thing that made him truly terrifying. He wasn't just violent. He was smart. He knew how to keep his hands clean while other people did the dirty work. He built layers and layers of protection around himself, using front businesses, fake identities, and a network of loyal associates who would rather go to prison than give him up. The FBI started building a file on him pretty early, but for years that file barely grew. Every lead went cold. Every witness who might talk suddenly disappeared or changed their story overnight. It got to the point where agents joked, darkly, that going after this guy was like chasing a ghost. But as his crimes escalated, so did the attention. Local police couldn't handle him anymore. State authorities couldn't handle him anymore. This was a problem that needed federal muscle, and that's when the FBI officially got involved, dedicating serious resources to bringing him down. Now here's where the story gets really interesting, because this wasn't just about arresting some criminal. This became personal for a lot of agents. They had colleagues who were threatened. They had informants who vanished. They had entire investigations that got quietly shut down because someone higher up got paid off or scared into silence. The deeper the FBI dug, the more they realized just how far this guy's influence reached. He had people on the inside, police officers who looked the other way, maybe even people within certain government offices who fed him information about ongoing investigations. This wasn't just a criminal. This was basically a shadow organization, operating right under everyone's nose. So how do you catch someone like that? Someone who seems to know everything before it happens. Someone who's always one step ahead. The answer, as it turned out, wasn't some single dramatic raid or a lucky break. It was years of patient, meticulous work, building a case piece by piece, like assembling a puzzle where half the pieces were missing and the other half kept trying to disappear on their own. The FBI created a special task force just for this case. We're talking dedicated agents, financial analysts, undercover operatives, all working together with one single goal: take this guy down for good. One of the biggest challenges was financial. This guy was smart enough to never keep his money in obvious places. He laundered cash through legitimate businesses, real estate, shell companies, the whole playbook. So the FBI brought in forensic accountants, people whose entire job was to follow money trails through a maze of transactions designed specifically to confuse anyone who tried. And slowly, painfully slowly, they started finding cracks. A payment here that didn't quite add up. A property purchase that seemed way too convenient. A business that reported way more income than it could possibly be making through legal means. Each of these was a tiny thread, and pulling on enough threads eventually starts to unravel the whole sweater. But finances alone weren't going to be enough to bring him down. The FBI needed something more direct, more concrete. They needed someone on the inside willing to talk. This is where things get really tense. Because getting close to this guy wasn't just risky, it was potentially deadly. Anyone who even seemed like they might cooperate with authorities faced serious consequences. So the FBI had to be incredibly careful about how they approached potential informants. They started identifying people around him who might be vulnerable. Maybe someone facing decades in prison on unrelated charges who might be willing to make a deal. Maybe someone who had a personal grudge. Someone who'd been betrayed or threatened by him at some point and was just waiting for the right opportunity for payback. It took time, but eventually they found their opening. Someone close to the operation, someone who knew details that only an insider could know, agreed to cooperate. Now, I won't get into every single detail about who this person was because honestly, protecting sources is part of what made this whole operation work in the first place. But what matters is that this cooperation gave the FBI something they desperately needed: real, actionable intelligence. Suddenly, agents had insight into how the organization actually worked. They learned about meeting locations, about coded language used in phone calls, about the hierarchy of who reported to who. It was like finally getting the decoder ring after years of staring at an encrypted message. But even with this new information, capturing the guy wasn't going to be simple. He was incredibly cautious. He rarely showed up in person for anything important. He used multiple phones, constantly switching them out. He avoided using his real name for almost everything. He moved locations frequently, sometimes staying just days in one place before disappearing to another city entirely. The FBI had to combine old-school detective work with modern surveillance technology. We're talking wiretaps, when they could get approval for them. We're talking physical surveillance teams tracking movements. We're talking analyzing phone records, even ones from burner phones, looking for patterns that might reveal his location. And slowly, the net started closing in. One of the turning points came when investigators managed to link him directly to a specific violent crime, something concrete enough to build an arrest warrant around. This was huge, because up until this point, so much of the case had been circumstantial, built on financial records and second-hand information. Now they had something that could actually stick in court. But knowing where to find enough evidence, and knowing where to physically find the man himself, were two very different challenges. This guy had spent years perfecting the art of staying hidden. He had multiple properties registered under other people's names. He had loyal associates who would lie to protect his location. He even had warning systems in place. People whose entire job was to alert him if law enforcement got too close. So the FBI had to get creative. They started using confidential informants to plant subtle pieces of misinformation, trying to smoke him out without him realizing what was happening. They coordinated with international law enforcement agencies too, because at this point, they suspected he might be moving between countries to avoid capture. This is where the story takes on almost a spy thriller vibe, because now we're talking about international cooperation. Agents from different countries sharing intelligence, trying to figure out exactly which side of a border this guy was hiding on. At any given moment, there were false leads. There were moments where the FBI thought they had him cornered, only to find out he'd slipped away hours, sometimes just minutes before they arrived. Each near miss was incredibly frustrating, but it also told investigators something important. It told them he was getting nervous. It told them the pressure was actually working, forcing him to make quicker, sloppier decisions than he normally would. And that's usually how these things go. It's not one single mistake that brings someone down. It's a pattern of small cracks, each one seemingly insignificant on its own. But together they create an opening. The actual break in the case came from an unexpected direction. Investigators noticed unusual activity involving one of his known associates, someone who suddenly started making frequent trips to a specific location that hadn't shown up on their radar before. At first it seemed like nothing, just routine movement. But agents decided to dig a little deeper, just to be thorough. What they found was that this location was being used as a temporary hideout, a place where the man himself would occasionally stay when things got too hot elsewhere. It wasn't his main base of operations, but it was enough. It gave the FBI something they hadn't had in years. An actual physical location tied directly to him. Now the pressure was on to move carefully. You don't want to rush an operation like this and blow years of investigative work because of an impatient decision. The FBI began meticulously planning a coordinated operation, bringing in additional agents, surveillance teams, and tactical units, all while trying to keep everything as quiet as possible to avoid tipping him off. They watched the location for days, confirming patterns, making sure they understood exactly who came and went, what times he was most likely to be there, and how heavily guarded the place actually was. Every detail mattered because one single mistake could mean he'd disappear again, maybe for good this time. Finally, after what felt like an eternity for everyone involved in the investigation, the FBI decided they had enough. It was time to move. The operation itself was carried out with military-level